On the 6th of September 2017, inside the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington, D.C., a Cold War battlefield opened without a shot being fired. There were no submarines surfacing in the Atlantic, no carrier battle groups turning into the wind, no Soviet bombers appearing on radar. There were only files, 82 declassified documents, roughly 2,000 pages, pulled from a long intelligence struggle over one question that haunted Washington for decades. What was the Soviet Navy really built to do? The official answer seemed simple: count the submarines, count the cruisers, count the missiles, count the shipyards. But the CIA files revealed something more difficult and far more dangerous. America was not only trying to measure the Soviet fleet, it was trying to read the mind behind it. For much of the Cold War, the Soviet threat in the American imagination wore the shape of missiles in silos, tanks facing NATO across Central Europe, and bombers pointed toward North America. But beneath that familiar picture was a quieter contest, fought in oceans where geography blurred, evidence arrived incomplete, and a single wrong interpretation could change how the United States prepared for nuclear war. CIA analysts, Navy intelligence officers, and national policymakers had to decide whether Moscow's fleet was a defensive shield, an offensive dagger, a nuclear launch platform, a political tool, or all of those things at once. The answer changed over time, and that was the danger. The declassified CIA collection spans the 1960s through the 1980s, but the story begins earlier, in the rubble after World War II. Stalin wanted a navy large enough to help deter Western sea power. According to the CIA's historical overview, the Soviet Navy underwent a dramatic post-war expansion, first in cruiser and destroyer forces, and later in submarines, becoming by several measures the second largest navy in the world by 1957, yet it was still not a true expeditionary instrument. It had size, but not global reach. It had ships, but not the overseas network, operational experience, or blue water rhythm of the U.S. Navy. The Soviet fleet was powerful on paper, but still largely tied to home waters. Then Stalin died, and the Soviet Navy's future nearly died with him. Nikita Khrushchev looked at the nuclear age and saw missiles as the decisive weapon. To him, great surface fleets seemed expensive, vulnerable, and increasingly obsolete. Major surface ship construction was curtailed. Cruisers were left unfinished. Resources shifted towards submarines, missile forces, long-range strike, and anti-submarine warfare. Naval fighter aviation was abolished. The Soviet fleet did not disappear, but it was redirected. The question for American intelligence became more complex. If Moscow was cutting some traditional naval power while building submarines and missiles, was the Soviet Navy shrinking in importance or becoming more dangerous in a new way? At Langley and inside the broader intelligence community, the first challenge was not strategy, it was visibility. The Soviet Union was a closed military system. Ports were restricted. Shipyards were guarded. Doctrine was buried in classified journals, internal debates, and military writings never meant for Western eyes. CIA analysts in the 1950s focused heavily on technical analysis of Soviet naval weapons and shipbuilding, while the Office of Naval Intelligence carried much of the burden on operations. Human sources were rare and dangerous. One of the CIA's early military sources, Lieutenant Colonel Pyotr Popov, provided unique classified material and information, while U-2 aircraft photographed Soviet military targets, including naval shipyards, bases, a new submarine base, and a Soviet submarine squadron in Albania in the late 1950s. This is where the story becomes more than a fleet count. A ship by itself does not explain a war plan. A submarine launched from a Soviet yard did not automatically reveal whether it was intended to hunt convoys, attack carriers, protect Soviet ballistic missile submarines, strike land targets, or serve as a political symbol in distant waters. To understand the Soviet Navy, American analysts needed doctrine. They needed the internal Soviet debate. They needed to know what Moscow's admirals believed future war would look like. That hidden debate began to emerge through one of the most consequential intelligence sources of the era, Colonel Oleg Penkovsky. The CIA's own historical booklet states that Penkovsky began reporting in April 1961 and passed articles from the top-secret special collection of the Soviet military journal Military Thought, along with other classified military publications, until his arrest by the KGB in 1962. His material gave the West high-level insight into Soviet military hardware, strategy, and internal anxieties about Khrushchev's reliance on nuclear strike forces at the expense of conventional power. The CIA noted that much of his material remained useful for naval analysis into the late 1960s and early 1970s, because major ships and sophisticated weapons could take more than a decade to move from decision to completion. In other words, the files did not merely describe what the Soviets had already built. They gave American analysts a window into what the Soviets had been arguing about years earlier, and those arguments were beginning to appear in steel, radar, sonar, missile tubes, and hull forms. Then came a moment that forced both navies to think differently. On the 20th of July 1960, the U.S. Navy launched a Polaris missile from the submerged USS George Washington off Cape Canaveral. A nuclear missile no longer needed a fixed airbase or a vulnerable surface launcher. It could rise from the sea. The Soviet Union now faced a mobile undersea nuclear threat that was difficult to find, difficult to track, and potentially able to strike from patrol areas far beyond easy reach. The CIA historical overview says the Soviets were unprepared for the threat posed by Polaris submarines, and later Soviet writings focused intensely on locating and destroying them. That one American capability reshaped Soviet naval priorities. The Soviet Navy did not just need submarines to threaten the West. It needed anti-submarine forces to defend the Soviet homeland from American submarines. It needed ships, aircraft, sensors, and doctrine, capable of finding something designed not to be found. This was the hidden logic of the Cold War at sea. Every new weapon created a new fear, and every new fear created a new fleet. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov understood that better than almost anyone in Moscow. He became commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy in 1956 and remained in that role for nearly 3 decades, long enough to outlast Soviet leaders, bureaucratic fights, and changing doctrines. Under Gorshkov, the Soviet Navy moved toward a larger, more capable, more globally active force. CIA analysts saw that the Brezhnev era brought another shift after Khrushchev's removal in 1964. The new leadership was more willing to support conventional forces and heavy defense investment, and the Soviet Navy became one of the beneficiaries. Gorshkov's achievement was not simply that he built more ships. It was that he gave the Soviet Navy a strategic argument for existing in the missile age. The fleet could protect ballistic missile submarines. It could threaten U.S. carrier forces. It could contest sea lines of communication. It could support Soviet clients abroad. It could show the flag in the non-aligned world. It could make the Soviet Union look and act like a global superpower. The CIA files show that by the 1970s, the analytical problem had moved from quantity to quality. American intelligence was no longer only asking how many ships the Soviets possessed. It was asking how they intended to operate, how ready they were, how they would divide forces among competing missions, and whether they could deny ocean areas to NATO. This was the invisible war behind the Cold War naval race. Publicly, Americans saw silhouettes of Soviet cruisers, grainy photographs of submarines, and congressional arguments over defense spending. Privately, analysts were trying to separate deception from doctrine. A ship could be misread. A missile could be misclassified. A deployment could be political theater, preparation for war, or both. Even the language created traps. The CIA booklet warned that Soviet military terminology did not always match American terminology, and that Soviet authors themselves did not always agree on the precise meaning of certain concepts. Translating the Soviet Navy into English was not just a linguistic problem. It was a strategic problem, and the Americans did make mistakes. One of the most revealing moments in the CIA historical overview concerns Soviet surface ships of the 1970s. Western analysts initially classified the main missile carried by the Kresta II and Kara-class cruisers and Krivak-class destroyers as an anti-ship missile. But the Soviets had classified those ships as large anti-submarine warfare ships, and one intelligence officer later admitted that Western analysts simply did not believe them. By 1975, analysts began concluding that those classes did indeed have an anti-submarine mission. The error mattered because it pointed to a deeper shift. The Soviet Navy might not be preparing only to surge into the Atlantic and attack NATO shipping. It might also be preparing to protect its own strategic submarines in defended waters. That idea became known in Western analysis as the possibility of a Soviet SSBN Bastion strategy. As Delta-class ballistic missile submarines entered service in the 1970s with long-range SS-N-8 missiles, they no longer had to pass through the most dangerous NATO anti-submarine choke points to threaten the United States. They could potentially launch from protected waters such as the Barents Sea or the Sea of Okhotsk. Western analysts speculated that Soviet naval forces were being configured to defend those areas. The Soviet Navy, in this interpretation, was not merely an offensive raider force. It was also a shield around the Soviet nuclear deterrent. That changed the American problem. If the Soviets were building a navy to protect ballistic missile submarines, then U.S. naval strategy could not be passive. It could not simply wait in the Atlantic for a replay of World War II convoy battles. It had to consider pressure on the Soviet maritime flanks, operations near Soviet home waters, and the possibility that the decisive naval struggle would occur close to the enemy's protected zones. By the 1980s, the Soviet Navy continued to grow in size and capability, while the Reagan administration reinvested in American sea power and pursued the goal of a 600-ship navy linked to a broader maritime strategy. The CIA overview connects this late Cold War naval competition directly to the changing balance at sea. But the Soviet fleet was not only preparing for war, it was also being used in peace. This was another lesson hidden in the files. Gorshkov's navy became a diplomatic instrument. Soviet ships appeared farther from home. The CIA overview notes that the first recorded post-war Soviet naval activity outside fleet home waters came in 1953 during a coronation fleet review in England, and that Soviet show visits followed in the 1950s. By the late 1950s, the Soviets were establishing a naval presence around Valona, Albania. By the 1960s and 1970s, Soviet naval units were operating more widely, and by about 1980, the Soviets were using and improving facilities at Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. By 1984, the Soviet Navy had a major presence there, including ships, submarines, naval aviation, auxiliary vessels, and shore facilities. This mattered because naval power is not only about fighting battles. It is about access, pressure, signaling, and presence. A ship in port can influence a government. A submarine tender can extend a fleet's reach. A cruiser near a crisis zone can complicate American decisions without firing a shot. The Soviet Union had long struggled with geography, limited access to warm water seas, choke points controlled by others, and fleets divided among distant theaters. Gorshkov's navy did not erase those constraints, but it pushed against them. It gave Moscow more places to appear, more ways to signal, and more tools to support clients abroad. The CIA files also show the limits of certainty. The collection itself does not claim to be the complete intelligence record. The CIA's overview notes that much of the information essential to the estimative process came from sources not specifically highlighted in the collection, including émigrés and defectors, the U.S. Navy, imagery intelligence, and signals intelligence. That is one of the most important lessons of the story. Intelligence was not a single file, a single spy, or a single satellite photograph. It was an accumulation of fragments, some human, some technical, some open source, some classified, assembled under pressure by analysts who knew that a wrong judgment could shape fleet construction. war plans, and nuclear risk. By 1979, the CIA collection describes NIE, the 14th of November 2079, as a watershed estimate on Soviet naval operations and strategy. By the time NIE the 15th of November 2082 was completed, the intelligence community had reached broader consensus about the Soviet Navy's major capabilities and likely operations. That did not mean every question had been solved. It meant the picture had become clearer. The Soviet Navy was not a simple mirror image of the US Navy. It was a force shaped by Soviet geography, ideology, nuclear fears, industrial limits, and the long shadow of American sea power. And this is the real revelation inside the declassified files. The United States did not defeat the Soviet Navy in a single battle. There was no Midway in the Cold War Atlantic. No great surface clash decided the age. Instead, the contest unfolded through patrols, exercises, shipbuilding programs, intelligence estimates, intercepted writings, satellite photographs, human sources, and quiet decisions made in rooms far from the sea. The U.S. Navy had to build, deploy, and plan against an adversary whose intentions were never fully transparent. The CIA had to help policymakers understand not only what the Soviet Navy could do, but what Soviet leaders might believe it was for. The enemy feared not only American carriers, submarines, and missiles. It feared the system behind them, the intelligence network, the industrial base, the alliances, the forward presence, and the ability to adapt when new evidence appeared. But the American side also had to respect the seriousness of the Soviet challenge. Gorshkov's fleet was not a fantasy. It was real steel, real crews, real missiles, real doctrine, and real pressure across the world's oceans. To dismiss it would have been reckless. To misunderstand it could have been catastrophic. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, many of those ships rusted, were scrapped, or lost their strategic purpose. But the files remained, and decades later, when they were opened, they showed that the Cold War at sea was never just a race for numbers. It was a struggle over interpretation. What does that ship mean? What does that patrol reveal? What does that classified article suggest about the next war? What is the difference between a navy built to attack and a navy built to protect the weapons that could end civilization? The answer was hidden in the files, in the patrol tracks, in the shipyards, in the doctrinal debates, and in the minds of men who knew that the ocean could become the first battlefield of a war nobody could afford to fight. The CIA's Soviet Navy collection reminds us that some of the most important victories in American history did not come from firing first. They came from seeing clearly enough, soon enough, to prevent the worst decisions from ever being made. If you want more forgotten war stories, declassified files, and hidden moments that shaped history, subscribe to Declassified War Stories and turn on notifications, because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.